Hello, I'm Tim Hayward, Microsoft Practice Lead at Cintura. Today I'm joined by Dave Bennett. Dave Bennett is an expert in his field, so I'll let him do his introduction.
Hi, I'm Dave Bennett. I've worked in the professional services sector for over 30 years, typically in legal and accounting as either an IT director or a CTO. And I'm here to talk about Microsoft AVD.
Thank you. So, traditionally, we will have associated remote desktops and virtualized desktops with one brand, Citrix. And that's been around for a long time. It's been considered the gold standard of desktop virtualization. What's your experience been with Citrix in the past?
I've used Citrix since the late 1990s, so as one of the very first people to install it in a legal firm pre the 2000s. I think originally it went up as an alpha software that I was used to in a different name, but since then I've used it in virtually all the firms I've worked through over the last 30 years. Typically it's been a standard, it's a well-received product by the technical teams, complex to use, but when it works well. Unfortunately, when it doesn't work as well, it's got a tarnished relationship with its user base.
And I think from an administrative point as well, there are a lot of overheads associated with that, and you need very strong skill sets to support and manage that platform to keep it watered and fed.
Yeah, I think Citrix, if you use it consistently, you have knowledgeable IT staff, and you invest in the infrastructure to start up with, then it works well. Unfortunately, that's not always the case, and as a result of that, it's got some bad press. These installations can always be turned around, but you generally want to get it right first time. Citrix, I think, where it's in its day was a really good product. I think it's the moment it's got some serious competitors who have come into the market at a later date and are investing heavily and potentially starting to beat it in areas where traditionally Citrix has been weaker.
And I think some of the latest Gartner Magic Quadrants support that, where you can see AVD and Microsoft being a leader in the field of desktop as a service, and the others aren't. They're gradually just getting lower and lower down the food chain in terms of their ability to deliver, their ability to execute, and importantly their vision as well. And I think you touched on a very important point there around the success of the implementation of those engagements, and that all impacts on the end user experience. And in today's day and age, that user experience and how they use technology it's really important, and how they embrace it and adopt it, because when they don't, they'll start to look at shadow IT, and there'll be all sorts of other complications that can come as part of that.
I think you have to be fair. Citrix has been around for a long time. It's the most mature virtual desktop solution around. Although it probably did lay back a little bit and not invest as much as it should have done a few years ago. So it's good at what it does. The user base liked it. I think nowadays you've seen better products coming along. They're not as mature yet, but they're catching up really quickly. And if you take some of the Microsoft tools and add other things to them, then they become a serious competitor for Citrix. And with the costs of Citrix going up and still have to maintain the complexity of the techie staff, it makes more sense to look at alternatives where it's appropriate.
No, I think that's reflected in a lot of the things that we see from Microsoft at the moment in that development of Azure Virtual Desktop and with Windows 365, where that maturity is very rapidly catching up, and a lot of the features that you'd have associated with USPs for Citrix are now gradually coming into the Microsoft arena. And then when we look at it from a security and compliance perspective, I think you briefly touched on security and compliance earlier, and some of the benefits that you get with that. A lot of those are bleeding into AVD and Windows 365, so that ability to protect your data and ensure that the data is controlled and secured in that environment.
Yeah, I mean, most people buy a virtual desktop solution because they want to look at controlling the desktop environment, making sure their data is secure, standardizing on the performance of the end user desktop. That hasn't changed in years. The things that are different is that you've now got the Citrix, not the Citrix. The things that are now different is you have the Azure data centers. So the Microsoft solution is tailored to work with 365 and Azure. It does that well, and with additional tools, you can save some significant money on the cost of Azure, which, if left unmanaged, becomes very cost ineffective. So I think what you're seeing now is that people are taking the opportunity of having come out of COVID and realizing that there's more and more security risks to the environment. They're putting more virtual desktop solutions back into the environment to control the compliance approach. And also the disaster recovery solutions that are coming through, because it makes it easier to manage and support.
And I think there's, again, that's some of the most recent announcements from Microsoft in that space really support using AVD and Windows 365 as that business continuity and disaster recovery solution, where there's recently been released a SKU where Windows 365 can be available to users for 10 days per year. So you pay £1 to £2 per user per month, and that will enable a user to use a virtual desktop solution for 10 days, any 10 days within that year. And that helps with scenarios where laptops are lost, stolen, etc. And you need to enable users to be productive straight away without having to wait for them to get a new laptop delivered, provisioned, etc. So that's significantly reducing the recovery times for these macro scale scenarios that you encompass. But also, when you're looking at it at a broad scale, I mean, traditionally we would have had rooms hosted in separate buildings. There's many companies that offered that solution where they'd have desktops pre-provisioned for you, they'd image them and get you in, and you'd go to that data center and work from there in the event of your premises being in a degraded state. Now we can do that from anywhere, and the solution's available to you.
Yeah, I think times have changed though. In the old days where you used to have these dedicated data centers, that's because, and you used to have to run these simulated tests every year. That's because that's what we had. Now the fact that you can log on to your environment in Costa Coffee or anywhere else in the planet makes it a lot easier to provide credible disaster recovery solutions for smaller firms. So I think we have to accept that times have changed.
Yes.
One of the things that I think Citrix still has over the Microsoft offering is the part-time user. So whereas Microsoft tend to license you for known users, I don't think they have a credible answer for part-time users, which during the COVID type of thing, where more and more people working in different patterns, became more prohibitive. Now things have changed again. So the climate has gone from people working so many days at home to more back into the office. So the model changes all the time, and you just have to be aware of the best thing for your particular firm. But still, virtual desktop is a very credible solution and a very easy way of controlling the applications and the performance and the systems you have, whilst being compliant and disaster recovery fulfilled.
No, and I think that there are, again, you touched on some of the perceived limitations there. Some of the newer capabilities that are coming out of Microsoft in Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365 at the moment cater for some of those needs, where you can have remote desktop sessions assigned to multiple users, so that it will cater for shift patterns. Sure. It will cater for part-time users who are working Monday, Tuesday, and other users working the rest of the week. And then from the security perspective as well, when you're accessing your remote desktop session from an unmanaged device, you can control what the experience is with that user against a user who's connected from a managed device. So if I'm connecting from my managed device, I'll be able to copy text in and out of the environment, but from an unmanaged device like a personal iPad or something like that, you can restrict what gets copied in and out so that you've got either one-way clipboard or no clipboard at all. So you're completely isolating that workspace that the user's working in.
Yeah, and all of that helps the compliance approach, which is essentially in a professional services firm.
So moving on to some of the challenges of migrating from platform A to platform B, whether that's Citrix or what was VMware Horizon, now NISA Horizon. How these are not very quick turnaround programs of work where you can go, right, okay, we're moving from Citrix today to AVD tomorrow. They take time to implement. Now, yes, if you drink the Microsoft Kool-Aid, you'll get the impression that it's a very quick turnaround and you can stand it up very quickly. But the reality is we need to plan these things. We need to invest that time into that migration. When you're working with a client and they've got these Citrix environments, how soon would you start to be looking at these essentially transformational engagements to move them from an aging legacy Citrix environment to AVD?
It depends on the complexity of the Citrix environment. So that's like a never-ending question. So most companies will use Citrix for in professional services for their legacy systems. So it depends whether you're phasing a system out or you're migrating to a system. So the argument is for a time you may end up with two different environments. The old legacy Citrix while you move to the more futuristic project, in which case you can move the simple apps over quickly. The problem is you're going to end up with 2 or 3 applications that integrate into a number of systems, and you have to take a big bang approach to them eventually. So you would essentially build your knowledge up on the simple ones, build an infrastructure and do a slow migration over. But you should do that with more than 6 to 9 months notice, simply because of the complexity and the amount of resources it's going to take from your original IT group to help the migration. So the same people doing the old world is going to be probably the same people doing the new world.
Completely agree. And there are also an awful lot of other stakeholders within the firms that we'd need to engage with, such as security, crucially compliance, because there will be a lot of factors within that transformation that we need to consider. Thinking from a very high level, your Citrix environment may be on premises at the moment, we'll be moving that to the cloud. We need to consider what guardrails that we need to put around that to make sure that the environment is safe and secure.
It also depends whether you're going to just take your old systems and move them into the new Microsoft environment, or you're changing the systems at the same time. So if you're just doing a lift and shift, essentially moving from Citrix to a Microsoft platform, then it's slightly going to be easier than changing the system all the way through. But the danger with companies in legal space or accounting space is that they have a view that they want to migrate to a new system, and therefore migrating to it in the new world is probably better than doing lift and shift and then changing. See what I mean? So I would, if I had to change the systems, I would move them into the new world and not shift them straight from Citrix to another world and then upgrade them.
Get that. But I suppose one of the other hot topics at the moment is the Windows 10 end of life. And Windows 10 still has quite a significant market share, and users either need to pay for extended support from October, or they're going to fall out of compliance and they're going to struggle to get their Cyber Essentials Plus recertified, or they're going to need other options. A lot of applications out there will work with Windows 11, and that can be a very simple migration path, but there are certain niche cases where a user or an organisation will need to maintain a Windows 10 presence. I think one of the big benefits from AVD at the moment is that moving your workloads to Azure Virtual Desktop will give you extended support updates inclusive within that use case. So there are some use cases where you can move to AVD, which would reduce cost, especially when you start to overlay some of the supporting capabilities that we'd use with Nerdio, and then use that as the launchpad to migrate to other applications.
Yeah, I think
platform in the future.
With any infrastructure change, you have to look at the pros and cons for each one. So if there's a reason why you're still using Windows 10, even in the short term, and it makes sense that you have to use it for 3, 6, 9 months, then you still need to get it supported, and therefore the only way of doing it is to move on to the virtual desktop from Microsoft. You can't just leave it in the background because it's not going to be patched or supported. So if it's that crucial to your business, it's going to have the security changes and patches it needs. So, but I would argue that Windows 10 has been around for a long time now, and therefore you're going to have a very good reason to stick on it. So it must be something very specific about your business. I can't think of many professional service firms that would need to stick on it, and yes, it was a legacy app. But it doesn't mean to say there aren't any, I just haven't come across one.
Yeah. And one of the points that you touched on earlier was around the control of the data and controlling where the data is stored and how users are accessing that data. I'm assuming that regardless of the hosted desktop solution you're using, whether it's Citrix or AVD, there are very strong reasons to do that so that you don't have data stored on a laptop, which can mitigate an awful lot of scenarios around losing laptop who could potentially access that data.
Yeah, I mean, from a legal point of view, you don't want your data to be left on laptops or be walking around the high streets and then suddenly losing a laptop. You need to make sure it's controlled and secure. Eventually, your firm will get breached. There is, by some hacker of some description, you can see even the best companies on the planet are getting hacked. By putting your data into a secure location like Azure, you are protecting yourself as well as you can, because the amount of investment that Microsoft make on that infrastructure. So having all your data in one location, whether it's Microsoft or any other, Amazon or whatever, is more sensible than having it on 200 laptops running around a building or around the high streets. It's just a matter of easier to manage and support. And when you do get breached, you know where the data is and what it was and what's going on. I'm not suggesting that all data centers are going to get breached. I'm just saying the likelihood is that sooner or later you're going to lose something, and being able to lock it down, stop people accessing it straight away is important. And not all companies have data leak protection software installed. So we still do have to face a lot of companies run with Word documents, Excel spreadsheets. They're copied, they're sent by email, they do everything they shouldn't do, but they still exist.
I think there's the nice thing with AVD as well there is we can integrate AVD and Windows 365 with some of those data loss and forensic capabilities, such as Microsoft Purview, that when there is the risk of potential activity being undertaken on a device, we can take forensic evidence of those scenarios. We can capture the screenshots and see what that user journey was, regardless of whether it was a physical or
the logic is
device.
that if you've got a company like Microsoft that stores your data, manages your desktop, runs your operating system, then the tools that they write and create are all integrated together. And in theory, they are meant to make it easier for us to manage and support. And as the products change, you can definitely see that there is more control and implementations from Microsoft that have controlled or are controlling our data. It's not as good as it's better now than it has been in the past, and it's going to get better every time they do a release. It's not perfect, but then nothing else is. So if you don't want to spend lots of money on different products, then that's a really good way of doing it.
Completely agree, and to just to put that into some other context, that 5-10 years ago, I don't think we'd be having this conversation around Microsoft being a security company. You would have always had to have had an awful lot of complementary ISV capabilities in your environment to support and protect your estate. Now, with Microsoft Defender, which again, from the security perspective, is a top right Gartner Magic Quadrant capability, we can really consolidate an awful lot of that tooling, which will essentially just improve the efficiency of the operations of these platforms.
Yeah, I don't. 10 years ago, we probably would have had a conversation about security, but not to the level that you do now. And also, it's interesting to note how much of a IT budget is taken up by security now, whereas in the past it wasn't one of the major contributors. security is a complex thing. It needs to be managed and implemented in a sensible and appropriate way, and you can invest as much as you want in security. And unfortunately, however much you invest, they're still going to get through. But also, the more products that go in means that your security teams need to have more knowledge and more awareness, and generally running 24/7, because hackers don't just work during the daytime. So the model is changing, and companies have to be aware that however good the Microsoft stack is, you still need people to interpret it and understand it and do all this sort of thing with it, which is why companies like Arctic Wolf and all the other guys come around and monitor your systems for you. As they bring new products in, the complexity of the infrastructure is more complex, although it comes across as it's simpler to manage.
Yes.
You just have to do more analysis and be more practical about what you do.
And I think a lot of that comes when you start to work with your security and your compliance teams, understanding what those risks are, what risks the business is willing to tolerate, and which ones are intolerable and need to be
You have
protected.
to get a balance between your IT, this is what we can do, or this is what we'd like to do, and the compliance, this is what we must do. So there's going to be an argument that says you can't do that because we don't have the tech, and there's another argument that says you have to understand what's practical from the business point of view and what the business is willing to do, or what in practice the end user who's using these apps is going to do. If it becomes too complex or too painful, they'll just get around it.
They will. And that, I think one of the points that I touched on earlier was that end user experience that they get. I think it's crucially important now that you give your users that platform that is usable, that is fast enough, that they're not immediately thinking, I've got to go and use this platform and it's going to take me 10 minutes to log in. You've got to give them a good user experience in which to do their work, otherwise they will find other ways around it.
Yeah, I think every company now runs client satisfaction questionnaires of how good is the various departments, one of which is invariably IT. People go home, they use their computers, their iPads, their phones at home. If they work substantially quicker or easier to use than the systems they use at work, then you're going to get negative feedback. So gone are the days where IT used to be able to control the end user. The end user now has much more rights into how the systems are designed and used than ever before. And quite rightly. So I remember the day where people used to send documents home because they couldn't work in the IT groups to get things printed or worked on. So they used to send them to their own machines at home and work on that way. These things will happen. People find a way around it. It's a bit like Jurassic Park, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. There's always a way around something. So just because you can doesn't mean you should.
So some of the subjects that we've talked about, Dave, have been around the use cases and the benefits of the business. I want to talk a little bit about some of the operational benefits that you're going to get with AVD, and notably with some of the complementary tools that we get through Nerdio. So Nerdio is a nice front end, as I call it, for AVD. The way I've described Azure Virtual Desktop to a lot of clients is it's like being given a Lego set, and you've got the picture on the box of what you've got to make, but you've got no instructions. Nerdio, it gives you that instruction set so that you can build it, you can follow all the instructions, you can follow the guides, and you can get a really good, well-managed environment. Some of those capabilities include the ability to optimize your host so that you've only got the number of hosts running, the right number of hosts running for the number of users that you're expecting. When you've got peak periods during the year, you can scale it up and you can scale it down during low periods. How much of a challenge to the sector is cost for these platforms?
Okay, well, the cost of products like Citrix to install are quite expensive, but once you've got it in and running properly, the costs come down. The advantage you have by bringing in the Microsoft solution is that you're taking advantage of your select agreements that you have if you're a typical Microsoft user. So you can bring the cost of the AVD solution down and compared to the Citrix. But Microsoft as a product is lacking in certain tools and features, which Citrix is ahead of, just simply because it's been around longer. So your argument of products and tools like Nerdio, products and tools like Nerdio. So your argument of products like Nerdio is that it allows you to manage the cost of usage of your Azure platform. And if you consider how much storage you're going to be making use of with an AVD solution, then the cost benefits alone of implementing a tool to manage that make it a viable option. Costs across the firm, nobody's going to, in a professional service space, the costs you make in your infrastructure aren't as significant now as they used to be, but your storage costs on Azure are still rampantly high. So anything that can bring those down. But again, it needs managing. So there are horror stories of where people have simply moved to the cloud and not thought about the managing of the infrastructure they have, and they leave servers running and don't have enough one day, but they do have multiple ones running overnight. So you need to actually manage that infrastructure, and the Microsoft stack on its own isn't sufficient to do that without some
complementary ISV.
So if you put your tools in, that works much better, and it also makes it easier for you to reduce the costs, and therefore the cost savings you make are significant in terms of storage, but probably not as significant in the overall budget as you would think.
And I think some of those capabilities that come to mind there with Nerdio that can support us in that enable us to keep profile sizes down. So users who are downloading lots of files, and you get profile bloat and profile proliferation, we can manage that, we can report on it, and we can shrink them where we need to.
This is all systematic of what was wrong with Citrix. So people downloading the internet just for a laugh, bloating their profiles, data leaks, memory leaks, all sorts of things. They were things that affected the performance. So anything that can manage that and give a standard performance over the bandwidth that you've got is great. You've also got to consider the cost of networks come down, so you've got more bandwidth to play with. But again, these are things you have to consider.
I think I'll touch on the storage point once more, and then I'll move on to the connectivity. That the other thing that Nerdio can do and does really well is when your data is not being used, it will move it to the cheapest storage possible, so that you're not paying for it. You're not paying for it to be on expensive storage while it's doing nothing, and then it rehydrates it and brings it back to the fast storage, so that your users continue to get the good experience, and you get the benefit of the cost savings when this platform's not being used as well.
In our practical environment though, the majority of documents that you use in a particular matter or a particular engagement are typically going to be under 6 months long, depending on you. I mean, some will go for years, but you only touch a very small number of documents. So whilst that sounds good in practice, in principle, quite a lot of the data will just simply go to slow storage.
Okay? Slow storage, anyway.
Which is good. And if you can marry that up with let's do some archiving when that data gets to the point where I no longer need it, is significantly better. And it's those sort of tools that make a difference in a professional service firm.
And I think when we start looking at some of the other features in the broader Microsoft portfolio, moving away outside of AVD for a minute, there are those capabilities in SharePoint Online and Teams, etc., where we can start to automate some of that. Where documents become a certain age, we can archive them off and we can move them to slower storage, and you can make them but still equally as available when they need to be.
The caveat though is that the Microsoft tool only manages Azure. So in most professional service firms, you're going to have a mix of Azure and AWS or other cloud hosts its solutions. And so some of the savings that you might perceive up front may not be there because the documents or whatever are stored somewhere else. So it's typical that as long as your document management system is being stored on Azure, you're fine. If it's not, then those sort of savings will be lost. And
moving on to the connectivity, you mentioned the connectivity there as well. Your connectivity to your desktop environment that's in your Azure, it's only as good as your connection to it. And I think that's one of the many areas that's often overlooked, or it's a service that's operated by another part of the team. I think one of the key benefits that Centura can bring to the table is our ability to bring a much broader solution than a lot of other MSPs do. I mean, for those that don't know, Centura originated as a connectivity business, offering all sorts of connectivity and still do. So we can offer that broad range of services, not only in AVD, but also ensuring that you get that good connection to the service. How important is that connectivity for firms?
Well, on the basis that if the data is stored in Azure and you've got no connectivity, you're dead. But in principle, the infrastructures used by firms now have become so embedded and intrinsically linked together that it's very rare that you have to consider an application without all the other components. So if you're thinking of using Citrix or moving away from Citrix or putting in a new finance or a practice management system, then its integrations with other components and the tools that it integrates with and how it comes back to the office are key. You have to consider the whole thing. So what you don't want to do is have companies or consultancies or internal IT groups that focus on purely networks or purely storage, or purely, because it's a combined system now. And with the advent of cloud, the integration between all the platforms is the most important thing.
And moving on to the models that a lot of these firms will be adopting to manage their desktop as a service, whether it be Citrix or another, how do firms often do that? Would they use a third-party managed service provider, or would they use their in-house capability to build these platforms and deliver it, or is it often a blend of the two? And I'll get on to the reason why I'm pressing on to these points in a minute.
I think it depends on the size of the firm. So in the older days, it would have typically been done by the in-house teams who use the applications and were using Citrix, and therefore they knew how the application was being used and what to lock down. I think more recently, as the products have moved, it's done more as a consultancy service. But it really does depend on how big your IT group is and how experienced they are in using the product. You also have to accept that some of the products that you now try and run through products like Citrix have to actually work within Citrix, and there used to be lots of configuration and hacks put into systems to make them work. And you still find now that running a solution, whether it's on Citrix or on a Microsoft stack, is the product lags behind for a virtual desktop environment than a real one, or a non-virtual desktop environment. So you have to be aware that you're talking to a supplier, they have to be aware that you're running it in a virtual desktop environment, and therefore it becomes more dependent on them to change the system to run on your Citrix or virtual desktop platform than just the IT group alone.
And I think that's important, because I know from my own experience recently, where I've been using a Citrix environment to access a client's estate and to access documents, there was always that question of who's the person who's using Citrix, because the version of Office that you've got is 6 months behind what everyone else is using, and we can't collaborate on the document effectively, and you're going to have to get out of Citrix or use something else. And that tooling has always been historically behind the rest of the estate.
Yeah, but also if you think about a professional service firm, their integration between their Office product and either their case management system or the practice management system has always been one of those key things, including document management. So you can't suddenly get Microsoft upgrading to the new version of Office 365 and it not integrating with your practice management solution. So you then end up with your virtual desktop running older versions of software, which is difficult if you then have an environment where you can run Citrix and a local Office. So you then have incompatibility between the two. So it's always very interesting to see what happens when a Microsoft upgrade comes through and how it affects on the virtual desktop, which stupidly means that the argument that you have with using the Microsoft desktop that's meant to work with Azure and also Office 365 gives it the advantage.
I think it's also interesting how new desktop as a service platforms like AVD are getting closer to the endpoint team as well. So if I look at a traditional Citrix environment and clients that I've worked with previously, you will have had your network team, you'll have had your end user compute team, and then you'll have had your Citrix team, which is a completely different part of the business. And I feel that with AVD especially, that's getting much closer to the endpoint management team, especially when you consider Intune for device management, which can manage your AVD environment. So those teams, I can see not immediately, but in the next few years might start to become more of a single larger team. It's a bit more collaborative. Do you think you could see that in the sector?
Yeah, I think you could take it a bit further and say that the people that make changes now to your desktop are influenced more by the end user. So the end user, whether they use their mobile phone, their iPad, their Android device or their PC at home, are much more knowledgeable about how they want their desktop and systems to perform. So if you've got some new features in Word and Office that make sense to use, why would you get them restricted? And I think that's the trick now. Is in the past it was restricted for performance. Now generally, because performance isn't the same issue, you should be opening up some of those features. But people prefer not to because that's the way it's done.
I think we're coming back to that end user again and the performance that they expect and the experience they expect when accessing these environments. I think that comes down to the leadership within the firms as well, and where that message is coming from about the direction of the technology, and that message of what we're doing with the estate and how that needs to be adopted by the business. It needs to come from the top.
It needs to come from the top and be provided in a coherent message. So you can spend as much on IT as you want to, and you'll get benefits but you have a limit of how much you can spend and the skills and the products you buy. And you can spend a lot more on security than you can on network lines or connectivity. So you have to get a balance between all the various components, and then once you've got that balance, articulate it out to your users and potentially some of your clients, depending on how they access it, to say, look, this is what we do, this is what we don't do, and this is where we stop. We can't give you everything you have at your home PC that you just download willy-nilly and connect it all together and Bob's your uncle. We have to actually think about the security side of things and the implications that you sending files around the world has on other things. So there's a lot more constraints put on the business, and that has to be explained to people that just come in and want to change the world.
Now, I did touch on earlier around that cost and that management piece and where I was going with that. There's within the Azure Virtual Desktop and the Nerdio model, there are two different ways that we can deliver services to our users through what's called Nerdio Manager for Enterprise, which is where we manage a desktop solution on your behalf. So everything sits within your tenant, everything is managed on your behalf. So in the event that you wish to move providers, it's a very quick and simple, okay, well, we move the management from supplier A to Centura or the other way, however that might be. So the other model that Nerdio offers is where we can manage desktops on your behalf. We can manage desktops as a service for you. So essentially we can say, you've got 10 users, here are 10 desktops that you connect to, but we own that management layer. How do you feel that the legal sector would prefer to procure services in the future? Would it be on that managed on your behalf where you own all of that intellectual property, or is there a gap in the market for that? Here's the desktop and you just connect to it and buy as many desktops as you need.
I think it depends on the size of the firm. So if you're in a small SME, you don't have the skill sets to do it yourself. I would be tempted to buy that as a service. In larger firms, they tend to have that knowledge or want to do it themselves. My IP on having a desktop build, I don't think is very relevant to a law firm or an accounting firm. How they use that system is more interesting to me. So I wouldn't perceive that building a desktop and deploying it to 200 users gives me much more of a strategic advantage to anybody else, because they're basically doing the same thing with the same apps. But how you get the end user to use those apps is where you can make a difference or incorporate different business processes. So that's where I would see the bigger gain. But for me personally, I would always look for a service provider to do it, simply because then I can focus other parts of my team as to look at how you change a business or how you integrate with the business, as opposed to worry about whether they've got the right desktop.
Interesting. So again, as with an awful lot of things, there isn't a one size fits all for everyone. It is dependent on the size, the structure, and really
also,
which.
You also have the concepts of some firms are more integrated to outsourcing than others. So you have a lot of firms that want to bring it all back in-house. So it does remarkably matter about the culture of an organisation, and I think there's no right or wrong answer. So some firms have outsourced, some firms are outsourcing, some firms have outsourced and it seems it doesn't quite work for them and they've brought some services back. From an IT perspective though, I don't see why small, medium firms want to create large IT structures. It makes more sense to get the expert to do it on their behalf where it's relevant.
And I suppose to add to that is to essentially transfer that risk to the service provider, as long as they tick all the boxes and they've got all of the accreditations that are needed.
They're there when it all goes wrong, and
exactly.
They have the accreditations to support and maintain it. Yeah. So, but that's no different to companies that outsource networks, productivity tools, management tools, security systems. It's just another thing.
Dave, over the next period of time, a lot of organisations will be looking at what their Citrix estate, potentially what their VMware Omnissa Horizon platform looks like for remote desktops, and they're going to be looking at what their future options are. Assuming that Azure Virtual Desktop, supported and underpinned by Nerdio, with a supplier implementing it and designing this for you, what are some of the key questions that every CIO, head of IT or partner should be asking of their IT teams or their IT service providers that will help them on their journey to the new world?
I think the answer to that is going to be very dependent on the individual firm. Okay, but realistically, if you're just considering it as let's replace product A with product B, then they would have to say, are the savings significant? Or should I be spending this money on other things? So moving for technology's sake, and yes, there's a real benefit, and that's got to be in terms of cost, or alternatively some sort of new tool or productivity option that you've got around to you, then that's fine. But just going from product A to product B doesn't make a lot of sense in its own right. So they have to think about, is it the right, am I going to make the saving? Should that money be better spent on other products? And if I was going to do it, how much resource am I taking out of the IT group or adding to it in the short term to do that migration? And will that impact other products or solutions? So usually you have a finite IT group. Usually you have a range of products to deliver during the year, and you really don't want to spend your entire time doing techie upgrades. You really want to get them on how do I make the business more profitable. So my view would be, is this the right thing to spend our money on?
So if I could add to that, I think there's a sentiment there of let's look at the bigger picture and the broader picture of what we're looking to do in the next 1 year, 2 year, 3 year roadmap, and where do these things fit in with that, and will it complement any other initiatives that we've got ongoing at the moment?
Yeah, so if you consider all your projects or programs of work that you're planning to do for the course of the year, look at them as a whole or as a program of activities, not an isolated instant. Is this where you want to spend your money? Because it might be better to move it back a year and implement it alongside other tools. So the obvious time to look at these products is when you're coming up for your software renewal. Usually people start that too late in the day, which is hence why you start it as soon as you can, or when you're planning to do that. But it's not always that obvious. So if you're coming along and delivering a lot of software programs or changes to your environment, is it the right time to do it and bite the bullet then, or do you phase it in? But it's all to do with how your IT strategy is based, and that needs to support your business. So if your IT strategy is just to let's upgrade technology for technology's sake, then I guess it doesn't really matter when you're going to do it, you're just saving a few pounds off your budget. But that's not really what the partnership or the business would want to know. It wants to know how it's going to make use of this technology and what benefits it's going to get, and therefore it makes more sense to do it alongside other things.
And I think that's where your partner, if you do have a partner supporting you on that journey, they should be instrumental and really pushing and driving you as well to not only realise the value of your investment, but identify where these things would fit in for the benefit of your firm, not
which goes back to it's no longer thinking of it networks only or data storage only. It's your infrastructure has to be considered as a complete and integrated system, an ecosystem, if you like, and every part of that ecosystem needs to be thought of. You have a range of projects that are going to go over this year, next year, and the year after. How are they all going to fit together, and when's the best time to do them? And if these products are late, how does that impact you? So I think it's, and then that allows you to finalise your next year's budget, or at least start thinking about those budgets going forward. All too often, people are just running around at the last minute creating a budget.
I think one of the nice things about Azure Virtual Desktop, with it being in the cloud, and especially when you're powering it by Nerdio, and you can stand up relatively simple platforms very quickly. One of the big benefits there is that you can undertake proof of concepts, you can scale out pilots without that initial capital expenditure, because most of the services are hosted in the cloud as well. So when you're considering that journey, if you believe that there may be a service that's right for you, such as AVD or AVD and Nerdio, then we can undertake those proof of concepts, we can prove the principles, and we can really prove that those visions that you've got for the future, whether it's 12 months, 18 months, 2 years in the future, will be the right track to start developing.
The downside of that is all cloud computing is quickly to come to market. So you can deploy an application really quickly using cloud. You can do a proof of concept quickly using cloud, and it can still never ever get used by the business because it's never then rolled out, or it's not rolled out with its true thought. You need to consider all the applications that you're going to push through it and the right time to do it, and have a concept about the end user. So the end user has work to do. So if we're going to constantly change the environment they work on or change it, then we have to do it in such a way that the user has a cat and mouse chance of understanding where they're going next. And all too often we do lots of IT projects with not as much care about what the results are as they should have done. So they were done for technical sake, not for ease of use. And if you're constantly doing that and changing from Citrix to another platform, is one of those purely technical projects, people will give you the answer of, or the question of, why do we do it? And it's harder to justify it if all you're going to be doing is saving a little bit of money off your budget. It has to come along with something that's going to make a difference. And that usually is a suite of applications or things. So think about how it's going to change the world, or the world that the people your clients work in.
And I think, again, there's definitely been a theme in this conversation where we're coming back to that user experience, we're coming back to what the users want, we're coming back to how the users interact with and use the technology.
Yeah, I think so. Just take a look at how mobile phones have changed, right? So if you consider the end of the BlackBerry, where you could just about do text, and now you can do everything on your mobile phone and quicker than you probably can on a computer. And how those applications integrate and how people download them, play with them, use them and throw them away and then get another app. And then they don't get any end user training, they just get on and do it. I'm not suggesting that belittles training, it just means that there's a different way of thinking now to when it was years ago. The problem you have in a lot of firms is that you have a range of people that think that way and people that think in a more traditional way.
Yes.
And you've got to account for all of them. So things have changed. And things will continue to change. I mean, the advent of AI will change quite a lot of things. But the whole concept is you can't just keep changing for change's sake. You have to change for a business reason.
I think that user experience and how we cater for those users as well, when you're working with a partner or you're working with your internal IT team to develop and implement these capabilities, whether it's a new application, AVD, whatever it may be, that we do cater for all of those use cases, because you will have very highly skilled, experienced subject matter experts in their field that are not native technology users, and we need to be able to support them and ensure that they can access and connect to these services in an efficient way.
Yeah, it's a balance though. So in a number of organisations, those SMEs have worked in a way or taught new people to work in a set way that they've been working for years. And unfortunately, as new products come along, working practices need to evolve. So it's not just fine to say we put a product in 3 years ago, we changed our working practices then. Your firm is constantly evolving. The way that you integrate with companies or changes considerably. And as you bring in new products, there's an overlap between the old ones. And so there are quite often better ways of doing stuff now. So it's good to talk to the SMEs, but it's also good to challenge them and ask them why they do it that way and ask them why those rules are in place, because some of them are historic and need changing.
So Dave, thank you very much for today. I think we've had a very informative view of how the legal sector is considering their options with many of the changes that have happened in technology, and crucially the pace at which Microsoft is improving their desktop as a service capabilities, and how the legal sector is or should be considering that in the broader sense of their other applications, their other services that they offer to their users. Is there anything else or any final thoughts that you've got for the legal sector out there?
That's such an open question to end on. So thanks for that. The argument I would have is that in terms of the concept that we were talking about, which was virtual desktop, the things that you need to consider are the compliance aspects. So the data storage, where is your data and how quickly can you recover from it? And also think about where it fits in your program of work. So anything with a security banner heading can be raised up the profile. But in principle, you've got a finite amount of resource to spend on your infrastructure. And whilst you'd like to change everything, you can't. So focus on what is important at the time within that program of activities. But do not underestimate the fact that controlling your desktop, supporting a user base on it, and making sure it works reliably from anywhere in the world is underlying the thing that you need to focus on to make sure it works. You fire your laptop up, it connects, you don't waste 20 minutes trying to get through to support. So pick something that's simple, easy to use, works, but while migrating to it, work out where the program best fits in your organization. It shouldn't be seen as a tech for tech upgrade, it should be seen as something that benefits the business and makes the business either more secure or more profitable. And in the case of a virtual desktop, it's got to be focused more on the security and the performance of the system more than the costs. Although integrating tools that bring down the cost of your Azure platform in terms of storage would seem to make a lot of sense.
Thank you, Dave. That's a really insightful view of AVD, and I think there's a lot that we as Centura can take on board there and consider when we're working with our clients. But it's also reassuring to know that a lot of the points that we've touched on, they are services that we can support our clients with. So Dave, thank you very much for your time.
No problem.